Everybody, this will be the third and final installment of this video in this accelerated graphics sort of section. I'm also going to use this opportunity to show you another resource for your final project. So I'm going to start here at 30S, and I'm going to go from 30S to the assignments page. And then I'm going to, from the assignments page, scroll down to the section called Final Project. Okay? So, sure, there's resources here, like you can read the description of the final project, you can watch a long video of me explaining the final project, you can watch a playlist of other students' final projects to get some ideas. There's a tutorial from back when there was COVID of me going through a sample kind of a thing. And there's another little sample here as well. Those are all resources for you to tap into. But today what I want to show you is this resource. It's always been there on our course website, on the help page of the course website. So now I'm going to click on help, okay? The help page for our 30S course. And from this page, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page, okay? Which, by the way, is what it said if you were to backtrack there a minute when I was clicking on it. That's what it says right here. It says at the bottom of this help page, right? So here at the bottom of this page is some sample code since we finished the methods unit. So, and I have referenced it before. When we did a walkthrough on some programming problems for the methods and the arrays unit, I showed you guys this resource and we went there to get some helpful methods and some helpful code to help solve the problem. Well, today what I want to show you is this fourth thing. It says sample code for a final project gaming example. So I'm going to open that up. So this is yet another resource potentially you could use for your final project. In addition to this 30S resource, I'm going to also take a second to open up the computer science 40S page. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to its help page. And I'm going to scroll to the bottom of the 40S help page. Now, it doesn't have all the different links like the 30S, but you can see a link right here that says a final project gaming example at the 40S level, so even more advanced. And I'm going to open that one up as well. These are both GitHub pages. But unlike normally where you copy and paste from a GitHub page, I'm going to go a different route today. What I'm going to suggest you do is actually click on this green button here that says code, because what you can do is actually download the entire example, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to download it. I'm going to do the same thing for 40S. Download it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a second to open up my downloads folder. And there they are. The two files have been downloaded. Now they're downloaded as zip files, so I'm going to unzip these things. And you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm just going to put them right on my desktop. So I'm going to start with 30S. It's a folder full of stuff. I'm going to put it on my desktop. And again, you're seeing me do this right off my website. Then I'm going to go back and do the same thing with 40S. And I'm going to drag and drop that. So a game example from 30S and 40S are now sitting on my desktop. Both of those were pulled right off of the help pages, right off our website. They've always been there. Now these also involve graphics, so they definitely still fit the theme of what I've been doing in these accelerated videos. But it's just yet another resource available for you guys. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going over here to NetBeans and I'm going to open these two projects that I downloaded. Okay, I'll do them one at a time. So I'll open from my desktop. There they are. Start with 30S, open the project. And while that's working, I'm going to do it again. And I'm going to open 40S. And now they're both open here, which means if I'm working on a project, I can go in there and look at the code and see the sample code and see kind of what I can do with it. Let's go in reverse order. Let's start with the 40S one. This is obviously a fairly complicated example that you could potentially use either some code from it or some ideas from it. I tried to comment it so that it's well explained. It's at the level of a 40S student, but it's definitely an advanced project, right? You can see it uses a lot of classes, right? A lot of different classes to do stuff. But let me just run it so you can see kind of what it is. Because I know it takes a minute for it to get up and running. It's not something that it actually has to take a little while to compile because it uses the graphical user interface sort of stuff we've been working on. It uses images. It actually uses sounds. There's an example of how to play sounds in it, which isn't something I had time to cover really in these courses. So there's always maybe pushing it a little even beyond the course in some of these examples. I like that. And I also think as well for you students, as this still continues to load up, you can find code anywhere. Like you can go on the internet and find code that you could possibly use to help with your final project. But at least when you use my examples, you know who the author is. So if you have a question about the way I wrote the code, you can come directly to me to figure out how it was working. All right, still loading, but let's minimize all this stuff. I told you it takes a little while for this 40S example to load up, or this 40S game example. I'll break the tension. It's a Pac-Man simulator game. It's not a full Pac-Man game, but it's got some Pac-Man elements to it. You're going to see some ghosts. You're going to see Pac-Man. You're going to see some dots that Pac-Man can eat. There's even some bonus fruit that Pac-Man can eat. You're going to hear sounds. It also has a high score where you can record your name and it will remember your name and stuff like that. That's the idea with this project. Now again, as it gets ready to load up, you can go in and look at these different elements of, for example, you could go in and look at what is pacman.java. And you could look at the code and see like how it loops through walls and how it animates and things like that. Hopefully we'll be doing that. Oh, here we go. So now I'm going to get Pac-Man moving around, and I'm going to go try and get that fruit that's in the middle. You can hear the sounds. And I'm going to go run into a ghost. Okay, Mr. Walks. There we go. So you get an idea kind of what some of the potential for something like this is. Okay? It's not a full program. It's obviously got some room for improvement, but it's still something at a fairly advanced level that you could tap into and possibly use a lot of that code at a 40S level. Definitely pushes beyond the course. All right. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the 30S one. I'm going to run that one. So close this one, go to 30S, run that. What I did with this one is I provided several different levels for this example. So what I mean is if you look in the source code, I provide 3 different examples of movement. Level 1 would be the simplest example, up to level 3 being the more complicated one. I also provide 3 examples of using a grid in a potential game environment. The first 2 are very simple. They're not going to be really games. Only by the 3rd one does it get a little more advanced. So anyways, let's take a look. So here you choose level 1 movement, level 1 grid, etc. Let's start with the grid ones. I'm going to do level 1 grid. So you can see here I can use my keyboard to just move a hero around the grid. That's all it is. Okay? So in theory, you could go in and look at the code for grid 1, and at a 30S level, it's just one Java file, and it's got a designer, and it uses code that, is at a 30S level. It's got some methods in it. It's got maybe an array in it, but other than that, that's about it, right? It's level 1. If you go to level 2, now maybe there's going to be multiple classes. By level 3 of grid, definitely multiple classes. So let's take a look at what these are. So maybe that would be kind of what you're looking for. So actually I'll do level 1 movement now. Level 1 movement, I can move my hero by pressing the key. Nothing happens. There's potentially an enemy here and potentially an objective to reach. There's also walls. I can't go through the walls. So that's maybe something you're looking for. If I touch the enemy, it's over. I lose. If I touch the objective, I would have won. So it's level 1. It's pretty simple. Now let's take a look at grid level 1. Or pardon me, level 2. This one also takes a few minutes to load. Take a sip of water. Dramatic pause. Okay. And again, I don't know if you're going to use this. You don't have to use any of this stuff. All I'm trying to do is provide you guys with more resources. So here it is. as my mouse moves around on the grid, it just colors in the squares that the mouse goes over top of. Why I wanted this for the second example is to incorporate things like the mouse into this, not just the keyboard, or not just buttons or things like that. So that's level 2. Level 2 movement, which I'm going to show next. Okay, now things are moving around more on their own, so I can move my hero without having to keep pressing the key. Oh, and I lost. Okay, so there it is. Now finally for level 3 of both of these, I tried to make something that's a little more game-like. So level 3 movement is kind of like what you saw in the 40S level. It's a little simpler. You can see there the walls don't look quite the same. There isn't as many dots and things like that. But it does in a lot of ways still function the same. And there's still animations and things like that. Okay? And finally, the final resource to look at here would be level 3 of the grid example. For this, I made a kind of a snake game, which maybe you're familiar with. So you can see here, it's using a 2-dimensional array or a grid. And I'm doing pretty good, actually. Usually I'm pretty bad at snake, but all right. And game over, and that kind of stuff is available. So all of that is a resource available for you guys to look at, should you wish to, and is available for you as yet another resource potentially for your final project. So again, that link was either on the assignments page when you're down in final project, where it says here's some more resources, or you can go directly to the help page, go to the bottom where you can find those resources. All right, today's goal is to finish up my examples of what I was doing with the crash course on graphics. So I'm going to start by opening where we ended up. So from Learn Graphics, which we worked on yesterday, it's launched a version of Graphics 1 and Graphics 2. Graphics 1 was built entirely using the NetBeans Visual Editor, a version of the same kind of thing that's available in Visual Studio. I didn't have to write any code. I was just able to use use some tools and a properties window to make the visual changes that I want. The only code I ended up adding was the one line to make the entire form or frame visible. Okay? In Graphics 2, what we did yesterday was instead of using the visual editor, we coded everything ourselves. So we wrote all the code to make all the same things kind of happen, to make J labels and J buttons, to add them to containers, to put images in the labels, to position them on the screen, all those details in the code. Even the form or the frame or the container itself, we set up the size, we added the title, all those things. But anyways, let's run it just to remind you where we left off, which was somewhere around here. 2 J-frames, okay? And I adjusted some of the numbers since yesterday so that they kind of match up almost the same, where we can see one is done using the visual editor and one is done purely in code. Now, none of these do anything yet. I can click the buttons, type in the text boxes, nothing happens. But they visually look like graphical user interfaces, okay? Today is about making them do stuff. We're going to start with the designer version of this first, okay? We'll start with the button. All I want the button to do is when I click it, I want it to shut everything down. So if you remember in Visual Studio, for those who took that course, the way you'd code a button was to double click it. Well, that's no different here. If I double click the button, it's going to go to some code that just said, add your code here. So I'm going to literally add system.exit 0, which is a line of code that will exit any program. Let's see if that works. So that's only on the one I did with the designer. This one still doesn't do anything. But that one worked. It actually associated an action with the button. So when the button's clicked, that action fires. All right. Now let's do one that's a little more challenging. Let's do this text box. So what I want to do with the text box is every time a key gets pressed, because that's what you do with text boxes, you don't click on them, you type in them. So that's a little different. I don't want to just double click a text box to do that. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the text box. And I'm going to go to, when I right click, this thing here pops up called events. That's another word for actions, right? An event that takes place with this text box. And you'll notice there's a word key here, right? So that essentially implies that the event of pressing a key is going to do something. So that's what I'm going to go to. Events, key, okay? And I'm going to go to key pressed. All right, so I'm just sort of slowing down the video here at this point. You right click on the thing you want to add an action to. You go to events. You pick which event you want. In this case, it's going to be the keyboard event. In a second, we're going to do a mouse event. And I'm going to go to when a key has been pressed, what should I do? You can also do key release. This is good for some games where you're holding down a key until you release it. So you can have two different events happening for each thing. So here I go, right click, events, key, pressed. It's the same thing. Just like the action of clicking a button, this is the action of pressing a key. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my J label. Let's try that again. The first J label, this one here, and you'll notice I didn't name anything. That's something that if you took the 20th course is a good idea to do. I'll talk more about that in a bit, but I'm just saving time right now. So I'm going to go to this thing called J. How do I know, by the way, it's J label 1? Well, the name of it's right there. Another way you can know is if you have opened the navigator, it shows you that it's named J label 1, which, by the way, is the way you should rename it if you need to. Using the navigator, although you can also do it right on the design, you can change its name. I can do it here, or I can do it over here. Change the name. But I'm not going to bother. J label 1 dot set text to be the words key was pressed. Okay? So let's see if that actually works. So when I type in the text box, it will tell me in that label that a key was pressed. Yep, you can see it there. Now, obviously, that big font I chose was maybe not the best idea. So let me go back and redesign that. Take that font down a touch. There we go. Rerun it. Type in the text box. There we go. Okay, let me add a little bit more to that. Key was pressed. And I want that key to be whichever key I actually pressed. So to do that, I'm going to use this parameter right here, which now as a 30S or 40S student, you know what a parameter is. So I'm going to go to EVT, that's the parameter, dot get. You can see here I got a few different options. Get key character, get key code. So I can get it as an integer or I can get it as a character. I'm going to get the key code. So what's the code for that key? Which is a number, right? So let's see how that looks when I run that. So the second I start typing in there, you can see there it's showing me which key codes I'm actually pressing on. Well, that's cool. So that shows you how you could potentially incorporate keyboard presses into a final project. The other thing I want to do is mouse stuff. So we're now going to do mouse stuff by going to the design, and this time we're going to do anytime the mouse is over top of this picture. So to do that, I'm going to start off the same way. Right click, events, mouse. Right click, events, mouse. Now I don't right click on anything. I right click on the specific thing I'm connecting an event to. So only when the mouse is over the picture, not the button, not the label, but the picture. And now you can see all the different things I could try to do with a mouse. Now, this is just mouse in general. Notice the word mouse appears 2 other places underneath it. Mouse motion and mouse wheel as well. So I'm going to redo it. Events, mouse, and I'm going to actually go to mouse motion. Okay? And I'm going to say anytime the mouse moves over this thing. So right click, events, mouse, motion, mouse moved. And here's the sitting here waiting for me to add code. Okay. JLabel1 dot set text. The mouse is moving over the image. Let's see if that actually works. Let's see if that label changes when the mouse moves over top of it. So the label isn't changed now, but when my mouse moves over top of it, oh, look, it changed. Now let's add a little bit more to that. Let's incorporate EVT this time, the same name for a parameter, but now it's not a keyboard event, it's a mouse event. So I'm going to get the X, put a comma, running out of space, so I'll move this down a line. And then use EVT again to get the Y as well. And then add to that like a little bracket, moving over at this X and Y coordinate. Let's see how that looks now. So now you can see as I move my mouse over the image, it's actually giving me the specific XY coordinate of where that mouse is on the image. Not over this stuff. And this still works. I can still type here, but when my mouse moves over the image. So I've just shown you an example of 3 different events. A clicking event on something like a button, a keyboard event on something like a text box, and a mouse event on something like an image. Gives you 3 potential ideas you could incorporate into your projects. Again, if you want to incorporate things like graphics and stuff like that. Now, everything we did in Graphics 1, I'm about to try to reproduce in Graphics 2. Now, the answer to this in Graphics 2 is this is a little bit trickier. Just like it was yesterday, we got to write a lot of code to make that all happen. And we prepared for that yesterday by doing this. Set up those actions. So let me make that into an actual method today called set actions. Jump to it, okay? So now we're actually going to make something called set actions, okay? And let me incorporate what it is. The various controls will use these things called action listener events. This is covered in way more detail, not in this crash course, but if you read through the content or watch any of the other examples, I go into much more detail on this, exactly what's going on. So I'm obviously going to cheat a little bit and paste in some comments here to explain what's going on. Okay? All right. So the first thing with action events you got to do is there's 3 parts to it. 1, you set up what's called a listener. So an event is listened for. Like, for example, clicking a button or pressing a key or moving the mouse. You listen like a mouse trap for a specific thing. Then you connect that listener to a specific object. Like the button is listening for clicks. The text box is listening for keyboard presses. The picture is listening for mouse stuff. Okay? And then finally you write the code that is the action or the response to it finding out that the user actually did that. All right. So let's do number 1. We're going to create an action listener, and I'm going to have to import some code here. Did I import the wrong thing? No. Oh, just one sec. Let me just add my own one on here. Action events. Okay, there we go. So this this is the code. It is not easy to write that code. So this is why if you use the visual designer and then you later want to write your own code, you could actually go in to the code and kind of steal that code as well. You might have to rename things, but it also is another way you could get at the same code. Now, the second thing we do after we created the action listener is connect it or add it to the specific button that we're connected it to. So now, in theory, when the action event of clicking on a button occurs, the exit code will run. So let's see if this works now in our second graphics example. Clicking the exit button also makes everything shut down. Yes, it does. Okay, so now we're going to do it all over again. We're going to now add the keyboard event to the text box. Going to do another import. Okay, but now it says when a key is pressed, it's going to do something. So let's see if graphics 2 now does the same thing. So go to graphics 2, and when I type, there we go. It's also working. And then finally the mouse event as well. For the mouse event, I'm going to do one more specific thing. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple more imports. And that is, I'm going to make a custom method all of my own, so that when it gets clicked, when the mouse moves, it jumps to my own special method. So I'm going to pop that in, that special method, below the other method right here called mouse moving. You don't have to do that. You can put all the code right there. But if you think about it, you are very indented right here. You're like 7 or 8 levels of indent in at this point. So if you're adding a bunch of complicated code, that could be a little hard to manage. So sometimes it's good to divide this logic up into multiple kind of methods and stuff like that. But nonetheless, what I hope is now the case is when I move my mouse over this one, just like when I move my mouse over this one, just like when I type in this one, and just like I type in this one, all of it works. Okay? So here you've seen 2 different examples of a way you can do it using the designer, which takes a lot of the heavy lifting off for you. It does all the coding, or you get to do it by coding it all yourself, or what I like to call a hybrid approach, mixing the 2 together. I'm going to pause this video for a second because it's almost bell time, so I can say goodbye to the class that's in here right now. And then I'm going to record another little piece of this video to add on. Then I will be uploading this video to match the other 2 for this series of Crash Course in Graphics. Okay, everybody, I'm back, and it's a little quieter in here now because students just filed out for the weekend. I hope they have a nice weekend, and I'm just going to put a little bit more in here to kind of wrap up this video and give you one last look at graphics, just in one final example to really kind of nail home all the things we learned. Just to review, graphics can be sped up in the process by using the NetBeans visual editor. It does a lot of the work for you. It positions things. It allows you to visually look at it as you design a user interface. You use tools. You use the properties window. It also, I'm about to sneeze, so I'm warning you. It also, excuse me, it also allows you to add the action events like clicking something or using the keyboard or using the mouse. And then I also showed you at Graphics 2 how all of that work that's done by the visual editor can also be done by you all by hand if you want. I mean, really, all the visual editor does is write the code for you. So let's do one more example of this, and let's make Photoshop, or maybe a slightly scaled down version of it. All right, let's get to work. Okay, so we finished up here with Graphics 2. Okay, so our current project has Graphics 1 and Graphics 2 and something called Learn Graphics, which just launches those 2 things. So now I'm going to add a Graphics 3, but I'm going to use a combination of the visual designer and my own code, so-called hybrid approach. So I'm going to start by adding right-click, new JFrame form, and I'm going to name it Graphics 3. Oops, JFrame form, Graphics 3. Okay. In it goes. Okay. So now I'm also going to take a second to edit the Learn Graphics so that it creates a graphics 3. So graphics 3 equals new graphics 3. And I could leave the other two out. We've already seen that they work. So maybe I'll just take a second to comment out graphics 1 and 2. Later I'll comment it back in, but I'm going to focus on graphics 3. Okay. I'm also going to take a second to edit the original Computer Science 30S file so it just does Learn Graphics, just to again speed up our timeline here on this last one. So when I hit play, all it does is go immediately to graphics 3, and I'm going to make it visible almost right away. I'm also going to delete from graphics 3, and this I mentioned back in the other one, the version of main that's in graphics 3 that the NetBeans editor puts in there automatically for me. I don't want to get confused. I just want graphics 3 to appear on the screen when I start my program. I should just see graphics 3 appear, right? That would be the idea. But I don't, because I haven't done the this dot set visible to true yet. And once I do that, then that one line of code should make graphics 3 appear on my screen. It's the only thing I see at this point. All right, so that's done. So let's go do some design work for graphics 3. Readjust this a little bit. Controls, and readjust this. Okay. All right, so what am I going to make for graphics 3? Well, I'm actually going to start with something up here called a panel. A panel, believe it or not, is a container object, just like a frame is. So a panel is designed so you can put things inside of it, but I'm going to use the panel as the drawing area. So I'm going to put a panel on here, stretch it out. Okay, for now, just make it big enough that I can draw on it. And I want to be able to control where I move things all myself. So I'm going to right click, set the layout to null, so it doesn't try to move things around on me. I'm going to add a border to this JPanel so that I can see the edges of it. I'm going to use something just simply called an etched border. And again, the way I just did that is I went to the property called border, and there you'll see that little 3-dot ellipse on a button, which implies that there's going to be more options for me to change. So I'm going to do that. Click it, etch border, OK. There, so you can kind of see the edge of it. Now what I'm going to use is these radio buttons, okay, to give some options. And actually just above the radio buttons, I'm going to put a label, and I'm going to put into the text of that label brush, or how about drawing tool type. What type of drawing tool will the user be allowed to select in this little program? And I'm going to put some radio buttons. One of those radio buttons will use the word filled oval. Okay? I'm going to allow the user to use a filled oval to draw with. And then I'm going to copy and paste that. And yes, you can copy and paste using the Visual Designer. And I'm going to switch it to an open oval. Copy those two things, paste those two things. So now I'm going to have a filled, not oval, but rectangle, and an open rectangle. And again, this will make a lot more sense once we get it kind of up and running. So the drawing tool type, and I'm also going to take that font and make it bold. Just doing a little bit of design work here. Okay. Now I'm going to copy and paste that. Did I do that? Nope. Copy, paste. Okay. Get something ready for down here. But I have one more, two more actually, of these. So I'm going to copy, paste, copy, paste. Position them. Try to line them up. Since I'm using the null layout, it's kind of my work to get them all laid out the way I want. It's not going to help me. Okay. So instead of an open rectangle, I'm going to actually do a 3D rectangle. Don't get too excited. It's not that 3D, but there it is. And then finally, for this last tool, I'm going to use something called an arc. A-R-C. Okay, now for this label, I'm going to switch it to drawing tool size, not type. Beside that label, I'm going to put something to be able to set a size. And you can see here I could put a text box where they could type in it, stuff like that. But I'm going to use this thing called a spinner. And spinner is just the Visual Studio or the NetBeans name for this thing, which allows you to not only type in a number, but I can also use the little arrow. So it's a little bit more of an advanced kind of text box for numbers. So I can use that to set the size using that little design element there. Then I'm going to put in some buttons. Okay? A series of buttons here. So one of the buttons will be used to set the foreground color. Okay, the foreground color. I will have another button for the background color. And then two more buttons. Okay, so the foreground color, the background color. One button to clear. And one button for what I'm going to call Starburst. Okay, so this will be enough. That's a lot of tools that I could potentially use. Let me put my panel, kind of line it up with this. Let me adjust my container or my J-frame to line up with this. Okay, that looks pretty good. In theory, that's what it might look like. Okay, something like that as a kind of a potential Photoshop / Microsoft Paint / drawing tool type program. Okay, that would kind of meet the needs of me doing this kind of funky design and making it all come together. Okay, so with that now in place, with my design done, okay, and if you want, you could use your navigator to, rename all this stuff and make it all kind of lay out the way you want it to. I'm not going to. I'm going to keep things pretty simple, okay? So you can see here some label, some radio buttons, another label, a spinner, some more buttons, okay? It's all laid out. I'm just going to dive right into the action events of this thing happening. Like what should it do, okay? So I'll actually start with this first button right here, the foreground color. So I'll double click it. What do I want it to do when you click J button 2, the foreground color? Well, I'm going to use it to set the foreground. That's going to be my own custom method that I'm going to make. So I'll just create the method. I won't write it yet. It goes down here. Okay? I'll jump back. Background color, same thing. Okay? So I'm going to just make my own custom method, set background, call it right here, use the light bulb to write it. I'll get to it later. Clear. Okay. Instead of just making it clear, I'm going to also use the same set clear. Maybe that's not the most accurate name for it, but I'll use it anyways. And then I'm going to do the same thing for Starburst. I'm going to write code that just says set Starburst. Oop, typo. Set Starburst. Okay, and I'll create a custom method for it. All right, so these are sitting here waiting for me to put code in. I'll get to the code. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the J panel. I'm obviously not going to be clicking on that, although I could click on it. I'm going to right-click, Events, Mouse, and I'm going to go to Mouse Motion. And this time I'm going to go to Mouse Drag, which is when you click and drag on it. So I'm going to do that. Right-click, Events, Mouse, Motion, Mouse Dragged. And it's sitting there waiting for me to do something. So I'm going to say, you know what? Set the drag but I'm going to pass it a parameter, this parameter, EVT. It's just in case I need to know like the X, Y, and all that. I think that might be useful when I get over to that method. Okay, go create that method for me. All right, so when I drag on the drawing area, that thing, now I'm going to add more to that drawing area as well. I'm going to add a second mouse event. This time I'm going to use the mouse wheel. And when the mouse wheel moves, so that'll be cool. When I spin the wheel on the mouse, what should I do? Well, I'm going to set the wheel. And I'm going to once again pass it the event, just in case I need it. And I'll create that method, set wheel. Okay. What's next? Well, okay. I've been setting all that stuff up. What about the little spinner thing right here? That little, like that label there. Okay, what about the spinner? Well, with the spinner, I want a slightly different event for that. So, whoops, I'm going to right click and go to events for the spinner, okay? For that one, it's a little bit of a weirder one, okay? You'd have to kind of look for it. And what I want to do with this one is what's called the state changed. So it's a change of the spinner itself. And this might be a little trial and error with some of these visual things. Like, how do I find the associated action for it? But this is the one I want to go so that when they change the state of this thing, something is going to go, something is going to change. So let's try that again. Right click event, change state. And I'm going to put into that I'm setting the spinner to be changed. I don't think I need the parameter for this one, so I'm not going to bother. If I later change my mind, I'll go back and adjust my method. Okay, then finally, for these radio buttons, I'm going to try to combine all those into one method instead of using separate methods. And I'll make the parameter for this method which button got clicked on. Okay, but to set that up, so just before we go and do that, I'm going to go back to code and go to the top of this thing and actually create some global variables for this. Okay, so some global variables for this program might be very helpful for me for how I set this up. Okay, now I can create my global variables up here at the top of my code, or I can set them anywhere as long as they're outside of a method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my global variables above all my custom variables. Okay, starting with some constants. Now, because this is an accelerated version of this, I'm going to be copying and pasting these in like this. So the global variables will include a minimum, maximum, change, and all the different brushes stored in constants, constant integers, and constant string arrays. The actual variables I'm going to be creating, same thing, will be which brush the user picks, what size they want for the brush, and in the case of drawing, where is the current X and Y value. So these would represent these variables, okay? Now, those are just integers, strings, and an array of strings. Some of them are variables, some of them are constants. I've lost my train of thought there. But now I'm going to make a couple that are a little more complicated, okay? These are what I'd be called class or object variables. A actual color object, two color objects for the foreground and the background. Something called a graphics object, that's going to allow me to do the drawing. A spinner number model, that's kind of a cool thing for the spinner. Just spinners are a little harder to work with. And perhaps the most important thing, a timer. So for those of you who did the 20S course, a lot of you use timers for your projects. In Visual Studio, that was something you can drag and drop on your design. In Java, you have to code timers. So, and then below that are going to be these custom methods, which I've already kind of set up. But all these objects are going to need to be imported, right? So import color, import graphics, import the spinner model, and import the timer, okay? With timer, there was a couple options. Choose the top option. So now if you go and look at things like imports, there's going to be a lot more of them. If you use the designer entirely without ever doing an import, the designer does a lot of the imports by just doing it like this on the fly. Okay. So that's some setup. All those variables are all set up. So now I'm going to go back to each of these things, each of these, what do you call it? Radio buttons. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just go to the action. So events, action performed. So it's essentially clicking on it. Okay, so when I click on that radio button, what should I do? Well, I'm going to make a method called set radio, but it's going to have two parameters. Which thing I'm clicking on, okay? So, okay, which button I'm clicking on. So this right now is J radio button 2. That's the button I'm clicking on, comma, okay? But now this is the important one. I'm going to go into my array of brushes at the specific spot for that brush, spot 0, okay? And let me spell radio right. So this button will be using from the array that particular brush. So let me create that method. Now why that's important is because now I can use this for my other radio buttons. So open oval, okay? And I could just double click it. It goes to brush 1. Filled rectangle. It goes to brush 2. But I also need to change this. Now, this I can see is number 1, and this one above it is number 4. Depending on how you copied and pasted it, you got to watch out for which one of these you're actually clicking on. Okay, sometimes it does that. I don't know why. This is number 5, and this would be brush 3. Okay, and again, you can see that 0, 1, 2, 3 is open rectangle, which happened to have been the button I just clicked on. Now 3D rectangle will be number 4, and that's number 6 right here. And then finally the arc, and this is intentionally supposed to be a more complicated example, right? Is going to be brush 5, and it's going to be the 3rd J radio button. Okay, so that is all the setup that now I can use to write all these custom methods. Okay, the custom methods. But I am going to add one more custom method, and it's going to go way back to when the form or the J-frame is first created in its constructor method. And what I'm going to do here is instead of doing set visible true, I'm going to do this hybrid approach where I've already been using the designer combined with my own code to launch my own method called initialize container. So I'm going to create that method as well. Okay, so this version of Graphics 3, just change the comment up here a bit, okay, uses the visual designer in combination with custom code to make a mini final project, a mini Photoshop, right? These were the required imports for this to work, and I might need more of them. And then I'm going to erase this weird code. This was my required package that was part of this for Graphics 3. And now I got to just work on all my custom methods. Okay. And actually, I'm going to move this one up higher. I'm going to move up initialize container to essentially do what it's supposed to do. Set the properties of this form. Okay. Or frame. It'll start with some of the frame properties like the size. Now these two numbers are probably wrong. The two numbers I need for this particular size are probably something closer to what you can see right here. 1062 and 462. But I find with the designer, they're actually usually off a little bit. So I'm going to upscale them a little bit by about 50 to 100 pixels. So I'm going to go 1200 by 500 to start. It's probably not going to be right, but we'll try that to start. 1200, 500. Now you can see it still sets the title, sets the size relative to and stuff like that. And I'm going to make the form appear. I'm going to do that too. Set visible true. And I'm going to be putting code in between that. So let's just see what graphics 3 looks like at this state. Well, the width is actually pretty good. That 500 will work for me. The width, or sorry, the height. The width, I think I want to go a little bit smaller. Still too wide. So instead of 1200, I'm going to scale that down to like 1150. And let's see what that looks like as a starting point. Yeah, no, 1100. Almost. Pull 20 more pixels off it. That's close enough. 1080 by 500. That looks like a pretty good size for my graphics 3. Some buttons, some spinners, some other buttons, and a drawing area. Okay, not bad, not too shabby. Now, in this initialize the counter container, I'm now going to set up some code to initialize some of the other variables. Some of these guys up here, like these are already set, they're constants. But my brush, my size, my X, Y, stuff like that. So let's set up some of those variables. So I'll move that set visible true down further, so we don't have to see it on the screen right now. Okay. Set the primitives to default values. So the size is set to minimum. The brush is set to brush 0. The X and Y are set to 0. Now let's set up some of our more advanced stuff, the objects. So the background is color.white. The graphics comes from this thing, which is called JPanel1. So let me change that. JPanel1. My spinner is actually named JSpinner1. So I'm going to pull that in there. JSpinner1. So I set the initial background color to white, the initial foreground color to black. I set up a graphics object for drawing on, and I set up a model for my spinner. This is just how you have to use some of these objects. All right, now let's go a little further. Let's set the variables to the defaults, which is misspelled, to the controls. Okay? So I want to set this very first JRadio button 2 to be the one that's selected. JRadio button 2 will be the first one selected. So I'm calling set selected true. My model, which is this thing, is setting up some of the stuff for the spinner. And then we already know that it's actually called JPanel1 is going to be setting up a background. So now the set visible true comes in a little bit later, but let's just see what all that code has done to the design. Okay, so it's now white. This is checked off. The size is set to 2. It's starting to get some of the look. Now some of these things I could have done with the visual designer. I could have went in and found a property to change these 3 things. So to set it to white, to check off the radio button, and to set the initial size to 2. I could have easily also done that with the properties window, but I'm taking a hybrid approach. Some of this I'm using code for, some of it I'm using the visual designer for. Okay. Finally, this is the tricky one. We're going to set up a timer. To do the timer, we had to create this thing called an action listener, which I literally did in the first part of this video. I set up an action listener for how that was going to be working. So I'm doing it again for the timer. And then I'm going to be calling a custom method called tick. Okay, so I don't have this custom method yet. Okay, I'll just sort of build it, but it's going to build it in the wrong place. So I'm going to cut it out of there and paste it sort of further down into my code. Tick. And back it up a little bit so it matches up there. So it's just waiting for me to fill it in later. But at least then the timer's set up. I don't run the timer yet, I just set it up. So now Graphics 3 has finished the setup for how it's supposed to look. All right. Now, I got foreground, I got background, I got clear, I got starburst, I got a lot of this stuff. But I actually think the next method I'm going to work on is this one, set radio. So I'm going to move that up to be the next method I want to work on. Set the radio button. I'll get to these other ones later. Okay? All right, so how am I going to set up the radio button? Well, to do that, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to rename this J button just button. I'm going to rename this string the brush. I think that'll make a lot more sense for what we're about to do. You've clicked on a button and you've been assigned a brush. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in all this code and then explain it to you, is I'm going to stop the timer. Just in case the timer is running, I'm going to stop it. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all my buttons in an array. And this kind of matters, the order in which I do them. So for me, they go 2, 1, 4. So let me start that. J button 2. J button 4. No, 1. And then J button 4. So I'll double check that. So it goes 2, 1, 4. This is why naming things is probably a better idea. Then it goes 5, 6, 3. Okay? So then it goes 5, 6, 3. So I put all my buttons in an array, loop through all the array, set them all to false, and then take the one button that I clicked on and set it to true. So let's see if set radio works. What it's supposed to do is when I click on a radio button, it sets them all to false and then checks one of them as true. But it also stores which brush I've selected there. So as a little bit of testing code, I'm just going to output that brush. The brush was brush. Now I'm going to erase that in a second, but this is just for good testing purposes. So here in the background, I can kind of see as I click on this, brush was open oval, brush was filled rectangle, brush was filled oval, open oval, 3D rectangle, and arc. So it knows which brush I'm actually clicking on. Okay, good. I can get rid of that testing code. All right. So I know I'm copying and pasting, which makes it very hard to follow if you were trying to type along. But this is a video, so you can go back and look at this. You can go back into my notes and see this in more detail. I'm also going to add a comment to this method, set radio. So there we go. Just like I set up a comment for initialize the container. All right, the next thing I think I'm going to do is, now that I've set that up, is I think I'm going to set the spinner. That's the next one I want to do. All right, so I'm going to move that one up. Set spinner. Make that the next method I'm going to write code for. And I'll start with a comment. Set the event for the brush size spinner. Okay. So this also will deal with the timer a little bit. If the timer is not set up, it'll stop. Otherwise, I get the size from the spinner so that I can set the size variable based on that spinner. Okay. Next thing I think I'm going to work on is setting the foreground color. Okay. For this one, it's a little bit more complicated. I'm once again going to be stopping the timer. Then I'm going to use something called a J color chooser. Ooh, better import that. So the J color chooser, what it is like a J dialog box, but specifically for colors. So you're going to see this when we get this up and running, that like a J option pane show message dialog, this thing shows a dialog for choosing colors. That's pretty cool. And then based on what that is, it'll be used for the foreground. Now the background code is basically identical, so I'm going to do that really quickly. Set the background. You'll notice it's basically the exact same code, just changing it to the word background, and I have to set the J panel to also have that. So graphics sets the foreground, the panel sets the background. All right. Next up will be clear. Clear is an easy one. Clear has only 2 lines of code. It stops the timer and then takes J panel 1 and repaints it, which is essentially a clearing option to clear everything inside of it. So it's built into panels to do that. For Starburst, Starburst is what starts the timer. So when I click Starburst, it starts a timer to start drawing stars. So with that one, it has 2 lines of code. It takes J panel 1 and once again repaints it, and then it starts the timer. All right, setting the drag and setting the wheel. These are 2 mouse level events. So with the setting of the drag, I'm going to use a big if statement here. And basically what the if statement does, and you know what, maybe I'll won't make this quite, I'm going to put the curly brackets into this after all. Just makes it a little bit longer. And I'll go through it with you. Okay. And I'm going to rename this parameter event instead of EVT. I never liked EVT anyways. So it stops the timer, because if you're dragging, there shouldn't be timers running. The timer draws the starburst. So if I'm dragging, that should be over now. And then I get the X and the Y from the mouse event. But I'm making a slight adjustment to it. Maybe I'll show you later why. It's just so that it looks like it's more in the center there. And then based on whichever brush it is it 0, 1, 2, 3? I'm going to use this graphics thing and use built-in graphics methods. Again, you can go and read about these in more detail in the notes or the content section of my website on graphics. All right, we're almost there. Setting up the wheel. This is a slightly shorter piece of code. So when I spin the mouse wheel, what should I do? Okay, and again, just snapping through this code right here. All right, renaming this to event. The timer stops. If the wheel rotation is less than 0, that means I'm rolling it up. Then I add to the change. I add change to the size. If it's not going up, then I subtract from it. Then I just check to make sure they're not at the maximum. Whew, we're almost there, but I want to get this video done. So look at all this code I put in here. Okay, from initializing the container to setting up the radio, setting up the spinner, to the foreground, the background, the brush, the wheel. Really, all that's left is the ticking of the timer. Now this is some really long code I'm about to paste in here, but the reason it's so long, mostly, is because I'm setting up the points to draw a star. So I'm essentially creating points for a polygon shape. So that's what most of the code is. It's not that complicated of code, it's just some math going on there. But when I paste it in, it's going to be a little intimidating for you to see all the code that goes in here. But let me put it in, and then do an import, because one of the things I need to do is import a polygon. And then the drawing area is actually called JPanel1, but then that should fix the errors. Okay, so I've put comments in to explain what's going on. Spacing between points, total number of vertices, that's a geometry term for the points of the star. Set up a width and a height, which is based on how big my drawing area is. get the X and the Y by doing some calculations, get all the X coordinates of all 8 points, okay, all 10 points, get all the Y coordinates of all 10 points, put them all into 2 arrays, set up some random color values for red, green, and blue, set up a random color, set up a polygon from the arrays, and then set the color and the polygon into my drawing area. Whew! Let's see what it does. Let's see if all of that code starts to come together. So I'll start by just clicking and drawing. Ooh, look at that. Let me try clearing it. Ooh, look at that. Draw a nice L. Let me draw a little happy face. So that's pretty cool. But let me see if I increase the size of that and then try to draw. Ooh, that's a wider drawing. But I can also use my mouse to do the same thing. I can roll my mouse to make it bigger or smaller. Okay, let's try a different foreground color. Look at that cool thing I can pick. I'm going to pick a blue color. And now let me draw with blue. Ooh, that's cool. Let me try a different background color. Let's try a canary yellow. So it goes in there, but it ended up, by doing that, it cleared it out. But still got my foreground color, still got my background color. Can still make it thicker. But now let's try changing it to an open oval. Okay, that's a different shape. A filled rectangle. An open rectangle. A 3D rectangle. That one's a little bit harder to see. Let me change the foreground color. Something else again. And finally the arc. And I'll change the foreground color on the arc as well. Look at all those different things. Let me show you again that when I scroll my mouse, not only is it changing here, so you can kind of see how big your drawing area would be, but foreground, background, clear, and then finally, Starburst. Look at that. The timer is drawing stars on the screen. Now, if I start drawing, those timers disappear, and all that works. So clear it, Starburst it. And then finally, how about 3D rectangle? Look at that, kids. Look at that beauty that is the mini Photoshop we've made. All that code is available on my website. Okay, let's put it all back together now. Go back to Learn Graphics. Graphics 1, Graphics 2. Okay, as a matter of fact, I'm even going to go back to all the way back to 30S. And in the example now, I commented out a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm going to comment it back in. To option 1, or sorry, option 0, and run this final piece of our example for the course year. So I've added a little thing you could learn about any of the units, methods, arrays, classes. And remember, I'm going to be putting this up on GitHub, so you can download it, any of the code you want. Or Learn Graphics are optional. Well, let's go to that one, Learn Graphics. Click OK, and there are 3 designs we made to learn about graphical user interfaces. Something that's not even required in your final project, but now you've had a crash course in it. Whew. All right, everybody. That's a bit of a longer video, I know, but it wraps up everything, including those sample final gaming examples that I incorporated at the start of this video. If you have any questions, please come see me. That's the end of this video. Peace.